relevant, reliable, and researched. This is Experts on Call, the show focused on delivering leading-edge news and information on today's most beneficial products and services. This is Experts on Call on AM 650.
Tony Giventu, Executive Director of the Condominium Homeowners Association of British Columbia. You're listening to Key Pacific's Talk About Strata here on AM 650. Along with Tony, I'm Sterling Fox, and our two guests from Key Pacific, President Dan O'Hearn and Barrett Hansen, who is Vice President of Operations. And there's that song. There's the Noisy Neighbors song, Tony. And it's grad season coming up. It's that time of year. So you've got the Noisy Neighbors out of control on a Friday night. And all sorts of complaints are flooding into the Strata Council the next morning. Oh, and perhaps even to the police department that night. How does that all get resolved?
Well, more importantly, we have hockey playoffs and basketball playoffs. So we have loud parties and all kinds of stuff. So the tenants are in the unit. They have a loud party. So what does Strata Council do?
Exactly.
So, Dan works and Barrett work with the Strata Councils, and, they work with the whole stage of people filing complaints, the irate phone calls. It ends up on your call line, your emergency line, whatever. So what do you do about it?
Well, first of all, it's not always the tenants that have loud parties.
Oh, exactly.
That's very true.
So let's get that straight.
All right.
And then if it happens to be a tenant, though, you're going to handle it in exactly the same way as if it was an owner.
Of course.
Because the tenants have signed this Form K. We know who they are. They understand the bylaws, rules, and regulations, and they have to adhere to it. And so we'll just follow the proper protocol there, which is we receive a notice of complaint, a letter's going to go out for them. There might be an opportunity for them to discuss this or dispute this.
Right.
And then the council's going to take that information and evaluate whether it merits a fine or penalty, which the tenant would have to pay.
Right.
And again, that gets back to as long as it's not a secret tenant. You might be in a situation where it's a person who's staying there. No one really knows who it is, and you think you're dealing with an owner, but they're not an owner. So it gets back to the proper administration and documentation.
And Barrett, what happens if there aren't, and Tony's mentioned this, there are some buildings in which there are really no bylaws concerning renters at all. How does that complicate things for you as the property manager dealing with renters in a building in which there aren't many bylaws to fall back on?
Well, it can complicate things. We always recommend our strata corporations to have a rental bylaw if they have renters, because the bylaws is the strata corporation's guide. It's kind of like your go-to book, so to speak. And along with that, also to have a rental administration bylaw, which sets out how to manage your rental restriction bylaw, and that's a very good first step in managing renters in a strata corporation.
Tony, let's talk about the nuts and bolts of renting in a strata environment. The procedures and protocols required. The tenant part is pretty easy. An apartment is available for rent. You go look at it, and you like it or not. And suppose I like it, I'll take it. Then what happens? What hoops does the owner have to jump through in order to make it all formal and legal?
Well, before the owners even advertise unit for rental, they should be finding out, A, if they have a bylaw in their building, B, if they're permitted to rent, and C, advise the Strata Council and figure out what that process is. So as Barrett said, the rental procedure is pretty critical. And, I was just thinking of a strata in Burnaby that had sent me a letter about a month ago. The treasurer of their building owns 3 units. He doesn't live there. He rents his 3 units. He's been doing so perpetually. The strata only permits 3 rentals, and he appears to be the only one who's ever allowed to rent his units. Right? And so you start looking at that. So you look at their bylaw to discover they have no rental procedures. They basically have a bylaw that's going to be very difficult to enforce, if enforceable at all, because the Act requires a rental procedure. Who's on the priority list? How do you apply for a rental? What's the term of the rental? Some bylaws will say things like when you're granted permission to rent, you must rent your unit within 90 days, and you may rent only for a period of up to 3 years or 5 years, and gives a very specific term. And in the event your tenant leaves, you must reapply for permission to rent, and the next person on the list is given permission to rent. because we'll have waiting lists for people with rentals, right? Some buildings might only permit 3 rentals. You might have a building that's only 20 units. 3 units rented in a 20-unit building is quite a lot,
sure.
right? But you could end up with other people wanting to rent. So we have to process a level of fairness. We have to apply some basic fair principles of equality amongst all the owners, and we can't treat owners and tenants as different classes of persons. So we have to, our bylaws, I think strata corporations seriously need to look at their bylaws right now and as how how enforceable they are with respect to the mechanics of things like pets, age, and rentals. When we see the Civil Resolution Tribunal come into effect a year from now, we're going to start seeing these kind of disputes. And the first place that we're going to be looking for information and evidence around a dispute under the tribunal is, what do the bylaws say?
Right.
And that's going to become a significant issue, I think, for many strata corporations.
Dan, do you have situations with strata councils without rental bylaws, and you actually have to sit down with them and go, you don't have any rental bylaws here, folks. You should probably whistle up a bunch and organize yourselves a whole lot better than you're doing right now. What do they offer up as excuses for not having gone there in the first place?
Well, you never go there until there's a problem.
Ah.
Right? It's usually the problem that shows you evidence that you've got some huge holes, right? And it's somebody who's either contemplated finding that hole and is working around it, or just accidentally found themselves in a situation where they're renting out and they weren't in compliance. But I think all the councils and corporations and management firms have to be really prudent, especially now as we'll have increasing numbers of tenants. I mean, the reality is not everyone can afford to purchase. Legislation is in place to allow tenants. So I think everyone has to address their rental bylaws immediately. And fundamentally to that too is how we calculate the number of rentals on the Form B disclosure.
Yes. Yeah. The Form B is the total number of rentals, regardless of their standing as to whether they're in compliance with a rental bylaw or not, or exemptions. So as a buyer coming in, I just know how many rentals are in the building. So if I'm a buyer coming in, but I'm also interested in renting my unit, don't rely on the Form B for information about the number of rentals. That doesn't tell me how many rentals are available under the bylaw. That simply tells me the total number of rentals in the building
at that time.
Yeah.
Dan, how do you square that circle if you're a potential buyer? Again, all you want is information, good, solid information, and it's sort of fuzzy. How do you straighten it all out?
Well, you hope that the Act says you can rely on the information that's given to you. So let's hope that the information provided is accurate. If you're dealing with an agent, have them make some more probing questions and certainly get that disclosure statement and review the bylaws. It's super critical that owners or potential buyers take a real interest in the building they're buying into, and reading the minutes and reading that disclosure statement. Far too many people are going in blind and then complaining about a situation.
Well, particularly, Barrett, as Dan was saying moments ago, it's likely that as we go forward in British Columbia, especially here in Metro Vancouver, that more and more strata environments are going to be occupied by tenants, by renters. It's just a housing fact of life, isn't it?
Yes.
So again, potential buyers need to know this, need to know about these changing trends and where they're going to be able to fit in successfully into an environment that will accommodate their needs and at the same time be the sort of place that everyone's happy in. And Dan, that's not easily accomplished sometimes, is it?
No, it's not. And you may have people that are blind enough that when they're buying into it, they figure they can always get away with the hardship clause. And I bring that up because that's often one that's used to rent out a property because they're having trouble maintaining 2 properties. They also have a house elsewhere, and then this condo, they're in retirement and they don't want to sell it because they're going to lose money because the market's corrected. And people have to understand that applying under a hardship, there's a lot of onus on yourself to prove that you're going to have hardship because of this. Just because you're going to lose some money doesn't necessarily mean it's a hardship.
Sure.
So hardship for you may be different for somebody else. So I wanted to mention that because that's a very common application for rental.
All right, let me take a quick break, and we'll come back with our last segment of Key Pacific's Talk About Strata with the Key Pacific key players and Tony Giventu right after this break on AM 650.
Delivering relevant and beneficial consumer information. This is Experts on Call. And there's more still ahead on AM 650.